So I'm gonna level with you guys. I just saw this movie last night and I already forgot about half of what happens. That doesn't bode well. The Mummy. So The Mummy came out in 1932, was directed by Karl Freund, and stars Boris Karloff as the Mummy, Imhotep. And this is a unique movie in the canon of Universal Horror because this is the first contemporary horror. It still has that gothic atmosphere and black and white photography that Universal Horror is known for, but it's set in 1932, the year the movie came out. So in that way, it's not an old Victorian legend or classic literature that they're adapting. They're adapting a story that's set in the modern day that they just came up with. And while this is an original concept, there are some very notable influences for it. Mostly Dracula. This is basically just Dracula in Egypt. But more specifically, it's Francis Ford Coppola's Bram Stoker's Dracula that I see the most parallels with, because Bram Stoker's Dracula focuses a lot more on the romance between the monster and the girl, and it also brought in this idea of a reincarnated love that really wasn't there in the original 1931 Dracula. But this concept mostly came about because of the 1922 excavation of King Tut's tomb, and that was a big deal. The discovery of King Tut's tomb by the British Museum unlocked a whole bunch of information that we just didn't know about before then, about mummification, about Egyptian culture and language and ritual. And since that was still a fresh thing on everybody's mind, the concept became, oh, what if King Tut came alive and started killing people? And now we have our Mummy movie. So what is the story here? Well, it's incredibly simple. In fact, it may be the most simple plot of any of these Universal monster movies. Imhotep gets awakened from the grave by some stupid archaeologist that reads a curse out loud, and so he wakes up and walks away. And his whole motivation is to find the reincarnated soul of his dead girlfriend, Anck-su-namun, or in the remakes they call her Anck-su-namun, but I think it's supposed to be the same person. But anyway, he does find her in the body of Zita Johann, and he does the Dracula thing where he puts her under his spell and makes her want to come to him so that he can perform this murder ritual where he stabs her through the heart and transfers her soul into the soul of his dead mummy girlfriend so that he can live forever with her and they can live happily ever after, I guess. But that's not going to happen because Edward Van Sloan is back, baby, playing Dr. Mueller, and he's accompanied with David Manners playing Frank Wemple, and they're just trying to understand this curse and trying to find a way to get her out of this spell to ultimately save her life. And as you might expect, there is kind of a weird love triangle going on between David Manners, Zita Johann, and Boris Karloff. And while I'm not a big fan of love triangles, a lot of times they can be very contrived, this one feels a bit natural in kind of the same way that Dracula felt natural, because it was this monster trying to get with a human woman, and she already has a boyfriend, so naturally there's going to be conflict there, and it works. So let's talk about the positives first, because there are things that I really do enjoy in this movie that I think are handled better than any other version of The Mummy out there, and this movie has been remade a couple different times, because this is the one for me that actually feels like a horror movie. The other two versions do have scary moments in them, but they ultimately feel more like action-adventure movies than horror movies. This one still feels at home with the other Universal monsters. And I think that's because of a couple things, one of which being that they actually got actors from previous Universal horror movies to come back in different roles. But probably most important for the tone is that there are quite a few intentionally silent moments that just add to the creep factor. For instance, the scene where the mummy wakes up is probably the best scene in the movie because it's very quiet, and it's not this idiot archaeologist just reading it out loud clear as day, enunciating every word. He's just kind of writing it down, transcribing, kind of mumbling to himself the curse just so he gets a mouthfeel of the words. And it's those mumblings that are admittedly kind of hard to make out that wake up the mummy, but the fact that the mummy starts moving, you associate that with what he's saying. So that way him reading out loud feels less like, oh, we just have to have him read out loud so that he can say the curse so the mummy can wake up, and more like, oh, he was just a little too careless and enunciated one or two phrases too clearly, and now the mummy's awake. And when the mummy wakes is awesome. The makeup job that they do on Boris Karloff is amazing. Jack Pierce, once again, knocks it out of the park. The facial appliance is flawless. The hands look great. The wrappings are good. They look old and weathered. They don't look super clean like they do in the Hammer version, but also keeps that classic mummy look of the wrappings that the 90s version kind of did away with. They just made him more of a CGI skeleton. And later on, when Imhotep takes on the persona of Ardith Bey, and he looks a bit more human, but he still has that wrinkly skin that's kind of like parchment. That also looks really good, especially because it's so subtle, where in some shots he just kind of looks like an old dude, but in other shots you really see the mummy deadness, especially how they darken his eyes in some shots, and it just makes you feel like he is the undead. And with the slow opening of the eyes and the slow moving of the hands, you really feel like this thing is coming alive, that it was dead and now it's awake. It also helps that that shot of him rising isn't the first time you see him. He has been lying there dead in the background of that whole scene previous and hasn't moved a muscle. So you really get a sense that, oh, this is just a dead mummy. It's a statue or maybe a dummy. It can't come to life. And then when it cuts and you start seeing it move, you do feel the horror. And what elevates it even more is the fact that when the guy sees the mummy awaken, he screams for sure like you would expect, but it's not like he screams and runs away or screams and keeps screaming. No, he breaks down laughing, because why not? The mummy just got up and walked away on your watch. What else can you do? And it's that mad laughter that's almost Joker-like, where you feel his sanity slipping from him and he can't do anything but laugh. It's very creepy, especially in a post-Joker world where now when you see people going mad with laughter and just cracking up and smiling, you can't help but make that connection with the Joker and the fear that the Joker inspires. But the sad thing is that this movie really does peak early. This scene is maybe the third or fifth scene in the whole movie, and the movie just never reaches that level of awesomeness again. It's kind of disappointing. But I'm still talking about the good stuff, and Edward Van Sloan will always be in the good category when it comes to these Universal monsters. And like I said before, he plays Dr. Mueller, who's this archaeologist that is the only person that actually fears the curse in the beginning of the movie, that tells everybody, hey, don't say it, don't even look at the scroll. And throughout the course of the movie, he's proven right time and time again. And he really is the Van Helsing of this movie, not just because he played Van Helsing, because he's the moral center. He's the only one that's been proven right throughout the whole movie. And now he's the one that actually has to come up with a plan to defeat the monster. And since this is going to be the last time I talk about Edward Van Sloan in this series, what a missed opportunity it was to just keep him as Van Helsing throughout all of these early Universal monster movies, because he more or less plays the same character in all of them. In Dracula, he was the moral center to defeat the vampire. In Frankenstein, he was the moral center that told Henry Frankenstein not to go through with his experiment. And here in The Mummy, once again, he's the moral center telling the archaeologist not to read the scroll, and now he has to kill the mummy. So Universal, take notes, because if you really want to do the Dark Universe right, don't have Russell Crowe play Jekyll and Hyde to be the Nick Fury of your universe. Have it be Van Helsing, because him being a vampire hunter can be extrapolated to just general monster hunter. You know, kind of like that movie that never happened. So that way you have a character that keeps trying to do the right thing but ultimately doesn't get listened to, and now we have monsters. And if you just ignore the names given to Edward Van Sloan in these movies and just think of him as a Van Helsing, this universe gets a lot more interesting and a lot more continuous, because you have this guy that has shown up in most of these movies, and it's not super distracting, and he doesn't have an alter ego that has superpowers. He's just a dude trying to do the right thing, but he keeps bumping into all these monsters. I just think that's a really cool concept that hasn't been taken advantage of in the 2 times that Universal has attempted a shared universe. But going back to this Mummy movie, the last good thing I have to say about it is that it goes a lot harder into Egyptian mythology and Egyptian times than I expected. And I didn't expect it to really show any stuff from ancient Egypt, but there is a pretty interesting flashback sequence where Imhotep and Zita Johann's Helen Grosfer look into this pool that shows old Egyptian times, where you see Imhotep burying Ankhsunamun, and the Egypt sets that they constructed for this scene look nice. You don't see a lot of Egypt, but the fact that they did take the liberty to show ancient Egypt in this 1932 movie was something I didn't really expect, and I do appreciate, because it helps flesh out the story and the narrative a bit more, and it does add some weight to the love story. And I honestly buy this love story a bit more than Bram Stoker's Dracula, because it deals with the will of Ankhsunamun kind of overriding the will of Helen. And that's just a cool concept, because it's a split personality thing where one soul wants something but the other soul doesn't, and there's this conflict there. And it's a really cool idea that I'm surprised hasn't been touched on in many other movies. There's a lot you can do with that concept. But now onto the stuff that I didn't like so much. So after the mummy comes to life, which like I said before is the high point of this movie, the movie slows down to a crawl, and there's a long time where not a lot's happening and you don't really know the characters that well, and you don't really care about the characters a whole lot because they're just kind of stock doctors and archaeologists. And as great as Boris Karloff is, I think he kills like one person, and he's the security guard in this museum. And so when you see him on screen, you're like, oh, he may kill someone, or he may hypnotize someone, or he may do some mummy thing. And while he does hypnotize a few different people, he doesn't do much. He kind of just stands around and stares and talks. That's just kind of boring. I mean, Dracula was kind of slow in some parts, but at least you saw Dracula doing Dracula things. He transformed, he bit people, he hypnotized people. There was a variety of things you could expect from Count Dracula. But here, until the climax with this murder ceremony, he doesn't really do much. And while I do find the whole love triangle and the idea of a reincarnated love interesting, the sexual aspect of it kind of falls flat because Imhotep is not going to touch her until she is in the immortal body of Ankh-Sunamun. So you know that she's more or less safe until that ceremony happens, which means that the implicit sexual nature of their relationship that was in the original Dracula is not there in the mummy. It just can't happen. They can't sleep together until she's in the body, and she's not in the body yet. So once again, we're kind of wondering, why are we still waiting for this ceremony to take place? Why hasn't it happened yet? But when the ceremony does go down and the two men try to stop him, it is pretty interesting and a little exciting, because for the first time in this movie, there's actual stakes. She's on the slab, ready to be sacrificed, and he's holding this ancient looking knife. But even then it gets a little weird, because while the men do interrupt the ceremony and he stops and there's a bit of a fight, none of the humans are responsible for Imhotep's death. The statue of Isis raises her arm holding an ankh and zaps the mummy, turning him back into a skeleton and dying. I don't know. You know, I give these horror movies a lot of grace when it comes to believability and realism, but that's pushing it for me a little bit. The execution of the execution with Osiris just felt a little goofy, with this statue just kind of raising its arm, and I don't know, it just felt a little cheap. But all that being said, do I like the movie? Well, it's kind of a mixed bag for me. The elements that I like in it, I really like. And I think they're the strongest in any mummy movie. But the experience of watching it as a whole is just kind of a drag in that middle section. And really, you could take a nap through the middle section. You wouldn't miss a whole lot. You could still probably figure things out whenever you woke up. And a movie that gives you that opportunity to fall asleep in the middle of it and not really miss anything is doing something wrong. And that's pretty much what I think of The Mummy. It's not a bad movie, but compared to what Universal has brought us already with its monster movies, this one doesn't quite reach it. But now I turn it over to you guys. What do you think about The Mummy? Do you like it? Do you think it's boring? Do you like any of the other versions better? Whatever you think, let me know in the comments. And if you like this video, be sure to give it a like and subscribe for more content, and hit the notification bell to be notified every time I upload a video. And as always, I'm Colby. This is my nerdy talk, and I'll see you in the next video.